China's top diplomat Wang Yi was headed to Moscow on Monday, a day after receiving a warning from the U.S. against arming Russia. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Wang Yi met on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference in Germany. In later interviews, Blinken revealed that the U.S. had information that China was planning to provide lethal support to Russia in its war in Ukraine, and that such support would carry consequences for Beijing.
We also had an opportunity to talk about the Russian aggression against Ukraine. We're here in Munich, and many of the countries here are focused, as we are, on that aggression. And one of the things that I shared with him was a growing concern on our part that China is considering providing lethal support to Russia in its aggression against Ukraine. And I made clear, as President Biden has, almost from day one with President Xi, that would have serious consequences in our own relationship.
And Beijing has responded by accusing the U.S. of spreading false information and cautioned it on finger-pointing on China-Russia relations. But let's get more context on this from Alicia Wachulska. She's a policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and joins me now from Warsaw. Alicia, Secretary Blinken has warned Wang Yi that China arming Russia will have serious consequences. What kinds of consequences are we looking at?
Well, first of all, China is denying all these accusations. Currently, Wang Yi, China's top diplomat, is on this charm offensive aimed at restoring relations with European capitals, especially with those having very close economic and political ties with Beijing. So in the context of China-Russia relations, China is trying to create this image of itself, kind of distancing itself from Russia. However, at the level of actual bilateral relations, we're not seeing anything like this. But we still don't have any kind of tangible evidence of China actually helping Russia in terms of actual military support. So here we're seeing this power play. Mm-hmm.
Go on, please.
So we're seeing this power play between Beijing and Washington with accusations coming from both sides. But in the context of Wang Yi's visit, this is a very obvious charm offensive and an attempt to convince Europeans that China can play a responsible role, allegedly responsible role on the international arena. But the fact that China is trying to build this narrative does not have to translate into Europe buying this kind of rhetoric. Right. It's very, very difficult to trust China, given the scale and scope of Sino-Russian cooperation in recent years.
Okay, I do want to talk to you about the charm offensive with Europe and the power play that you're talking about. But first, let's just try and assume for a moment that what Secretary Blinken is saying, China's purported plan to arm Russia, is potentially true. And if this were, I need to ask you about the timing of it, because Russia began to face battlefield reversals last year in October itself. Why has China waited so long to decide to arm Russia?
Well, it also sorry, it depends on what we actually define as Chinese support. So there are many different forms of aid that China could potentially offer to Russia. Economic aid is one dimension, and we're seeing bilateral trade boosting in past year. But for example, when it comes to more strategic help, for example, in terms of new technologies or semiconductors that Russia is in very, very desperate need of, we're actually seeing a lot of bilateral trade also in this kind of components, but they are not cutting edge. So we have many implications here. China is selling certain types of equipment that could be potentially of dual use to Russia, but we don't know what Russia is doing with this kind of microchip from China, for example.
Right. Why is it in China's interests to help Russia? What does China gain from this?
From Beijing's perspective, the current war in Ukraine is not a war of aggression, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, but it is rather a proxy war between the US-led international order and the authoritarian powers such as Russia or China. So in this context, Beijing shares a very similar view of the world and of the norms that should be governing this international order, and is trying to rhetorically support Russia in terms of combating these norms and values that are promoted by the US. So in this worldview, there is no room for Ukraine being actually a sovereign state with its own consideration, its own agency, its own interest. Mm-hmm. It is rather about China and Russia trying to strike back against what they see as the hegemonic US-led international order, which does not work in favor of autocratic states.
How do China's purported plans to arm Russia square with Wang Yi telling the Munich Security Conference over the weekend that a Chinese peace plan was in the works? I mean, is China no longer neutral? What is China saying here?
Well, as a matter of fact, China's position on this war hasn't changed at all since the very beginning of the invasion. So what we've heard this weekend in Munich is a recycling of certain ideas that were put on the table already in March last year, with Xi Jinping proposing this action plan to peacefully, quote unquote, peacefully resolve the Ukraine crisis. And this time, what China is putting on the table is actually not a peace plan, but according to the Chinese readout, this is China's position on the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. So look at the wording. It is not Russia's invasion. It is not Russia's war against Ukraine. It is the Ukraine crisis. And it's China's position on the political settlement. So here, all the framing and the way China is presenting this solution, it all implies that there will be some concessions towards Russia. This is basically employing the language of Kremlin to propose a settlement that is not necessarily taking into account what Ukraine and what the majority of European countries think about this situation.
Also in Munich, Wang Yi was at pains to point out that the initiative lay with Europe to try and stop the warfare and to use its strategic autonomy in the process. What was Wang Yi trying to do here?
China has been for many years trying to exploit the concept of European strategic autonomy, but the way Beijing understands this concept is very peculiar. So for China, the most important part of European strategic autonomy is an attempt to distance Europe as a continent from the US. And for Beijing, the strategic goal here is to prevent a more unified front vis-a-vis growing China from developing on the international arena. So China is trying to drive a wedge between Europe and the US, also in the context of the war in Ukraine, by trying to appeal to some European capitals, especially those who are rather keen on the notion of European strategic autonomy, for example, Paris, in this attempt to drive a wedge between Europe and the US.
Are European powers themselves united when it comes to relations with China?
To a certain extent, yes. So on the macro level, we are seeing a shift towards seeing China as more of a strategic rival rather than a partner, economic partner only. But on the other hand, we still see many divisions on the continent. For example, now in Central and Eastern Europe, especially in the Baltic states or in Poland, we're seeing this move towards seeing China as an enabler of Russia, which changes the calculation. But on the other hand, we have Germany, we have Italy, we have France with vast economic interest, having a very different view on certain issues.
We'll leave it there for the time being, but thank you so much for breaking that down for us. Alicia Bachulska from the European Council on Foreign Relations, thank you very much.